My name is Lesley Frew. I'm a member of the Web Science and Digital Libraries Research Group at Old Dominion University, and I'm going to be presenting Coming Back Differently, an exploratory case study of near-death experiences of web pages. So I'd like to start out by showing you two captures of the same page taken about a month apart. On the left, you can see that this is a capture at the Wayback Machine. It was taken January 28th of this year, and the website is a page on the CDC website, which is the Centers for Disease Control, which is a US federal website. And on the right is the same web page 1 month later on February 24th. And these two captures, you can see by looking at them, there's absolutely nothing that's different about them except for the date that they were captured. You could run these pages through some kind of change analysis tool. It would tell you that there weren't any changes. So the question is, can we assume that if there were no changes in between January 28th and February 24th, according to these two snapshots, that the page never changed in between these two dates? So let's find out. Some context for the data set that this case study worked with is that in February of 2025, there was an executive order, just the bell, an executive order from the United States president. There were a couple of them. One of them dealt with gender, but the issue was that then all of the US federal websites were not in compliance with these executive orders. And so the initial decision was that all of the websites would just be taken down and they would not function at all anymore. The CDC in particular was in the news because in addition to their web pages, they also have a large number of public health data sets. And so all of those were unavailable. Very quickly, a federal judge ordered the government to restore all of the web pages. The issue is that the web pages have critical public health information, so they can't just be removed. If some of them meet the executive orders and some of them don't, that needs to be done individually. So that was the judge's order. Please restore everything. You're welcome to edit individual pages, but you can't just take down the entire website. So the pages were restored. If we go back to that web page that we were looking at earlier, in fact, it didn't stay the same in between those two snapshots, and now we know why. So on February 1st, we can see that it stopped resolving. It had a 403 HTTP status code. And then on February 6th, it came back, but it looks a little bit different. There's now a banner, and it says that the website is being modified to comply with the executive order. And then maybe it could have changed and maybe it didn't. In this case, there wasn't anything that needed to be removed, but the website didn't stay the same in between those two original dates. So we can't assume that there weren't changes in between. We wanted to know how prevalent this was, and it turns out that we found in the Wayback Machine over 8,000 CDC web pages with this same pattern. They were resolving with a 200 status code, then they stopped resolving, some non-200 status code, and not a trivial one like a canonical redirect, a true 404 or 403, or a redirect to a 404, something like that. And then they started resolving again with a 200 status code. So over 8,000 pages that fit this pattern. So this pattern of resolving and then not resolving and then resolving again, we're going to refer to it as a near-death experience of a web page. Obviously, if a web page stops resolving permanently, it is dead. So this was a near-death experience. We're gonna, explain this metaphor a little bit in terms of humans first. So this researcher, Leah Moore Mioded Danone, she interviewed a bunch of people that had a human near-death experience. It's not a common experience, but it is well known. People have heard of the term. So this person, Roy, he was hit in the head by a shell and he was declared clinically dead. So that's the first stage. The second stage was that he was brought to the hospital and he was actually in a coma. So he was clinically dead, but not, he still had some life signs. So Roy says about this stage that he's kind of in between complete darkness, between hallucination and consciousness. And then finally he woke up from his coma, but he wasn't the same. He did rehab for 6 months, and even then he's still not the same person that he was before he was hit in the head by a shell. So these three stages, again, were identified by the researcher as the three stages that go with a near-death experience. And so the way to think about it is that life and death are just part of a continuous sequence rather than dichotomous categories. We're going to see these same 3 stages with web pages. So the web page is resolving, it has a 200 HTTP status code, and then something happens. It's a non-200 status code, and there's no guarantee that it will even come back. So that's the clinical death stage for a web page's near-death experience. But for all of these web pages, they did come back. They came back, but they looked slightly different. They had a banner. It said we're being edited. Liminal stage on other data sets might look slightly differently, and we'll look at examples of that as well. And then finally, that banner is removed and the web page has either been edited or it hasn't been edited. It has come back perhaps differently. So let's look at each of these stages in depth. So again, we found many CDC web pages that had this non-successful HTTP status code. Earlier, we saw a 403 status code. The one you're looking at right now would be a 404 status code. It just says the page you're looking for was not found, but there wasn't any redirect. It still has the full URL of this page in the address bar. Here is another example of a non-200 status code that we found in this data set. In particular, I mentioned that cdc.gov was notable for all of its data sets. The entire data subdomain redirected to this soft 404, which says data.cdc.gov is temporarily offline. So the original URL wasn't preserved. They're all just datainfo.html. This kind of redirect, where a bunch of pages are all redirecting to the same thing and it's being used as an error, it's called an error sink, and that's terminology that was coined by another member of our research group, Kritika Garg. She had a paper at the website conference a few months ago, so I'd encourage you to read that. We looked at in our data set, were these all the possibilities? So we started with the entire CDX, which would include all the resources as well as the pages, the images, the JavaScript, the CSS, everything. There were a lot of status codes within there, but once we filtered out for more common status codes and just HTML, these were the 4 we were left with. And redirects, 403 forbidden and 404 not found. In other data sets, you might see some other causes of a clinical death stage. Bot prevention could result in a non-200 status code. Either intended or unintended server unavailability could as well. The next stage of this near-death experiences for web pages is called the liminal stage. And the liminal stage is just the time in between what was and the next. It's a place of transition. And this term is used in various contexts. On the screen, you can see a picture of the Oval Office in between US presidents. So each president decorates the Oval Office however they would like. So in between, they clear it out. So this particular time and space at the Oval Office, it was neither belonging to the previous president or the next president. It's just in a state of transition. And so we're going to see that same kind of state of transition with the web pages as well. In this data set, we've talked about they added this very short, concise banner. The web page is being modified to comply with the executive orders. So every user that sees this banner knows this website is in a state of transition. It may be edited, it may change, it may go away entirely. We're not quite sure. Some of the web pages in this data set still have their banner, and it's a slightly more wordy banner. For these pages, the government decided that they weren't able to edit the page to comply with the executive order, but because the judge ordered that all the pages had to be restored, this is the banner they added. So this page is in a permanent liminal state until another judge makes a different ruling. Again, this might look differently in other data sets. What you can see on the screen is an example of a liminal page from a data set of blogs by women in between 1996 and 2001. And you can see it says waterfall is closed for repairs. Another example of a liminal web page could be, if you think back to GeoCities, the under construction GIFs. There's a large collection of those online that you can go view. So both of those would be, pages that are in transition. So these liminal web pages, they're highly fragile. They're most likely going to change or maybe even be deleted permanently. And so again, all of these little banners and splash page notes and under construction GIFs kind of give the viewer an indication that the page is in transition. Finally, we're going to talk about the coming back differently stage. So one thing that's really unique to this data set, it's not unique only to this data set, but it's a great feature, is that the CDC web pages contain a last updated date. It's viewable on the page. I've boxed it in red for you. It's also machine readable. If you view the source of the web page, there's a meta tag that has the date as well. And so certainly not every web page has this information. There are other web pages that contain last updated dates, especially legal web pages, but these web pages all have this meta property. And so it's going to allow us to do an analysis of like how frequently they were changing and things like that. So we started by doing a manual analysis, and I was working on this page, and I was doing my manual analysis, viewing it in the Wayback Machine Changes tool, which is what you see on the screen. So on the left is this web page on January 24th, 2025, before the web pages disappeared. And then on the right, you can see the same web page, February 10th. So that would be after the judge has ruled, after they've been taken down and come back, maybe even after the banner. So the Wayback Machine Changes tool will highlight all the changes for you, which is why it's such a great tool for viewing how web pages have changed over time. And you can see it's highlighted that a good amount of text was deleted from this web page. But the thing is that if you look at the last updated date on both of these versions, it still says January 8th. And we know that that's not true, because the version on the left is from January 24th and the version on the right is from February 28th, from February 10th. So we know that in between those two dates is when this web page was updated, but that's not what the last updated date says. So we wanted to know how prevalent this silent update phenomenon was. So we took all 8,000 of our candidate web pages, all the HTML web pages in that in the CDX file, and we again used a combination of manual and automated methods to kind of figure out, well, which ones were announced and which ones were silent. So first we did a boilerplate removal, and that is from the EDGI group, and just some general standard text analysis tools. And we found that out of the 8,000, like 7,000 were unchanged, about 1,500 were changed according to that algorithm. So then we needed to do some additional analysis. We wanted to know which ones have the meta tag. So we found that 957 had the meta tag and didn't have a change in date, even though there was evidence that the text had changed. And then we found some that they hadn't changed, they had changed and the date had been updated, so those are announced changes. And then we also found some that didn't have the meta tag at all, like the main pages might not have it, directory listings, things like that. So we wanted to investigate those like 900 pages with the meta tag that showed evidence of the silent update. Once we started our manual analysis, we noticed that the boilerplate removal wasn't working completely. It was saying that some of the pages had changed, but only their footer had changed or only their breadcrumb navigations had changed, which isn't an update to the main content of the page. So we updated that boilerplate removal algorithm, and it's 5 years old, so that makes sense. And we found that there were still 772 web pages with these silent unannounced updates. We wanted to see, were they deleting things, were they adding things? And so only 38 of those pages had pure additions. That wasn't very common. 180 had deletions, like we saw in the previous example, but most of the pages, like 550 of them, they were mixed. They had some additions, some deletions, so some true editing going on. So in conclusion, we presented a small case study of CDC web pages that experienced, what we're calling a near-death experience. We examined these pages in the context of their lifespan. We identified 3 stages of this near-death experience that could be applied to other data sets. They're certainly not particular to just this one. And then in our particular usage, we examined the last updated date, and because 10% of the pages we looked at had silent updates, we can conclude that that last updated date is not trustworthy. Thank you, and I'm happy to take questions.
Lesley, you're right on time. You finished just 1 minute before.
And no fire alarm.
Yes, and no fire alarm. So we have 10 minutes for questions. So go ahead, please.
I've got a question. I'm going to use my own rules and come to the mic. So Lesley, I was curious about your methods for change detection. And that you were able to identify when a change occurred. And I know from some of our previous work that we're able to both identify the change when a change occurred, but also the extent to which it occurred using some algorithm like SimHash. Did you investigate any of the sort of content that was changing on that to be able to identify perhaps the classification of the data that was being changed, sort of what was targeted specifically on the web page beyond just there being a banner saying we prohibit certain sort of content? Thanks.
Uh, yeah, that's a great question. So that's some of the work that's in progress. We did start with the NSF list of forbidden words, and there were some of those that were deleted, but it wasn't a major factor in the deletions. So again, that's why we started doing a more manual analysis, and then we got a little bit distracted by having to rewrite the boilerplate algorithm. So certainly that's what's up next, is why were these changes made? What's driving the individual changes on the pages?
I have another question, Lesley.
Sure.
Just a question. So, one of your conclusions was that this CDC last updated date tag is not trustworthy. So do you have any idea if it was trustworthy before this 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 experiment, or would you say that it was just such a specific specific event that happened, that occurred, that you wouldn't know, you could trust it before then, before February, but not after?
Yeah, that's a great question. We haven't looked in particular. We looked at some other just some change benchmarks a few months ago. And what we found when we looked at those was that it depended on the administration, the presidential administration, whether or not like what they were doing. So my guess is if we were to look at the last updated dates, we would need to look by administration, and there may be different levels of trustworthiness depending on the presidential administration. Again, that's something I'd have to do as future work, but that would be my hypothesis based on the previous work that I've done.
I have a question here. So in my lab, we do a lot of restoration work, and when we make changes to the code of any website, we reissue the new version as version 2 or version 3, whatever it is, right? So Webpages might have up to 10 or 15 versions, depending on how much is done over the time, over time. You're not able to do that, but it's interesting if you could publish this information so that people know that what they're looking at is a different version. Are you getting that information out? When we do this, we put a little sticky note sometimes that, in this website, we updated the MOV file to MP4, something that tells the reader why it's been changed. So there's some ethics in the changing. I can't control what the administration does, but we can at least let people know, here's a list of websites that have been changed, and here's what we found was changed on it. Are you doing that by any chance?
That would be some great future work for us to do. One of the things that we're looking at is how to present these changes in a way that the user understands exactly kind of what you're talking about. So the semantic meaning of the changes, but also even more just on a basic version, the way you're saying, like, hey, there was a change, even though it wasn't announced. This is a new version of this web page. So certainly that's something we'd like to incorporate into whatever we end up with as our overall system at the end.
Thank you.
All right. Any questions in person or online for Lesley? Oh, we got one over here in person.
Hi, thanks. That was extremely interesting. A quick question, and I think you covered it, but just to get back over it. So this picture of the sort of change between captures is something you've effectively had to completely construct. So it's not something at the moment you could take for essentially any page. So this sort of the infrastructure to do this, I take it doesn't exist.
So this particular screenshot that I have up on the screen right now, this is the Wayback Machine changes tool. So if the Wayback Machine has captured the 2 versions that you'd like to look at and not a different web archive, then it can compute the changes for you and highlight them in this particular context. If it's a capture at a different web archive, then that tool doesn't exist.
Okay, thanks very much indeed.
Yeah.
Right. Any further questions online for Lesley?
Yeah, I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, John.
Hi, Lesley. You show in the first slide like 2 snapshots, right? So yeah, that's a really specific example. So my question is more about like, what was the motivation? How did you notice something like that that motivated you to study like this type of silence changes?
Sure. So this particular data set, we didn't know there were silent changes, but we did see the news that they had taken down the websites and then restored them. And so we had this sinking feeling that they had been changed. So then when we started doing this manual analysis and we realized there was a last updated date, that's when we realized that they weren't complying with their own last updated dates that they publish. And that's when we decided to look more into that. So it wasn't preordained. It was something that we discovered along the way.
Okay, great. Thank you.
All right. Any further questions online or in person here? If not, then thank you, Lesley, for the presentation, and we'll go on to the next paper.